Last Sunday I was preaching at St. Nicholas, and after the service one of the congregants came up to me and said, your sermon reminded me of the peace of God and of the love of God. And I thought, that's wonderful, thank you. How, in what way? And he said, it reminded me of the peace of God because it passed all understanding. And it reminded me of the love of God because it endured forever. See if we can do any better this morning. In coming alongside our two readings today, I'd like us to talk about the Sabbath. And we will look briefly at its past and then explore its purpose and its power. So firstly, let's just quickly look at Sabbath's past, its origination in history. In Genesis chapter 2, right at the end of the first of the two creation narratives, we read this: "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day God had finished the work he had been doing, and so on the seventh day he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done." It's probably quite a familiar passage, isn't it? And that holy seventh day became known as Shabbat, which literally means to rest or cease. And then in the Ten Commandments, which are where in the Bible? Quick Bible quiz. Where do you find the Ten Commandments? Exodus. Deuteronomy. Yes, Exodus. I think the archetypal, the classic version is Exodus chapter, anyone know? 20, did someone say? Woohoo! 10 points to Chris, well done. But they also crop up in Deuteronomy 5 and slightly differently in Exodus 34. But anyway, there we go. In the Ten Commandments, straight in at number 4 comes, "Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy." It's actually the commandment which has the longest explanation or clarification, and importantly, including that the day of rest must extend to servants. The Deuteronomy version goes as far as saying slaves. It is what we might these days call a humanitarian commandment. So Shabbat becomes enshrined as a central part of Jewish life. And over time, there emerged more detailed ceremonial laws to be applied in observing the Sabbath. So what does proper observance mean in practice? Well, I'm glad you asked. There are 39 specific things that it is forbidden under rabbinic law to do on the Sabbath. They are called melacha. And they include carrying, cooking, planting, building, kindling a fire, extinguishing a fire, and so it goes on. They also include untying a knot and making 2 loops. And it turns out that these 39 activities were identified as being all of the activities that were required in building the tabernacle, the tent of meeting that they built during the Exodus in 1500 BC, where God was believed to be present. Over the centuries, rabbinic law has evolved to make sure that these regulations keep pace with modern life. When I was at school, one of my closest friends, and as it happens, a very good guitarist, was from a Reformed Jewish family. For the sake of anonymity, he's still a good friend today, we'll call him Lawrence. His real name was Michael Bauman. Oh, bother. Forget that. Anyway, I remember having conversations with him about whether turning on an electric light counts as kindling a fire. And apparently it does. Although using special Sabbath timers rather cleverly solves that problem. Anyway, I was quietly impressed by the seeming discipline with which his family observed fast days, such as Yom Kippur, which also meant an extra day off school, of course, and the Sabbath. Lawrence himself, it emerged, was not super observant. We played in a band together, and when we had a gig on a Friday night, he almost literally shimmied down the drain pipe to sneak out to play. And we snuck straight back in as soon as he finished. I think he got away with it. But as we read in Numbers chapter 15 of a Sabbath breaker, who in his case had gathered some wood, being put to death, I thought even now that anonymity might be wise. Jesus and his followers, as they were Jewish, of course, observed the Sabbath. Although as we read in our chapter from Luke, and which we'll come on to in more detail, Jesus applied rather different principles. And that continued in the early church. And of course, it was still on the last day of the week, Friday sundown to Saturday sundown. When did that change to Sunday? Well, I'm glad you asked. In fact, it was the Roman Emperor Constantine in around 320 AD. He converted to Christianity, and as a former sun worshipper, he decreed that the Sunday should be the holy day. The change was later adopted by the church at the Council of Laodicea in 363. I hope you're taking notes, by the way. As a slight digression, we now, of course, really have 2 days of rest from work with our newfangled weekend idea. Where did that come from? Well, I'm glad you asked. In 19th century Britain, factories still closed on Sundays only, but they found that the workers, rather than spending the day off in worship, generally went out and got hammered. And the resulting hangover-driven absenteeism on Mondays became insupportable. As a result, factories started to close at lunchtime on Saturdays, giving the workers more time to sober up for Monday morning. It's also why many churches started organising football matches on Saturday at 3 o'clock, by the way. That's a different story. But the first official 2-day weekend in the United States, at least, was established by, any ideas? No ideas. It was Henry Ford of motor car fame. In 1926, he introduced the first full 2-day weekend for his employees. Someone else followed suit in the UK a few years later. Any guesses who that might have been? Cadbury? Well, it wasn't Cadbury, that was a guess. It was a chap called John Boot, who owned a chemist's business. Can't remember what they were called. In 1933, he opened a major new factory in Nottingham, and he found that efficiency was so good that they were producing way too much. He could have made a load of people redundant, but instead he chose to give them 2 days off each week at the same pay. A humanitarian action consistent perhaps with the ethos of the original Shabbat. By the way, John Boot learnt his chemist skills partly from his mother, but mainly from a book called Primitive Physic, which was written by a chap called John Wesley, one of the founders of Methodism. Maybe that drove his humanitarian thoughts. So there we are, a whirlwind guide of Sabbath's past. But what of Sabbath's purpose? What did God mean when he commanded to keep the Sabbath holy? Well, that brings us to our 2 readings from Isaiah 58 and Luke 13, because they bring us God the Father's message and then Jesus' message on the point or the purpose of the Sabbath. Written in the 8th century BC, the book of Isaiah sets out warnings of judgment, predictions of the fall of Israel and Judah, but also God's promises of restoration and compassion. He also famously prophesies the Messiah in extraordinary detail. In chapter 58, God is speaking through Isaiah to his people about how they worship, including reference to the Sabbath. Very similar to what Jesus will say in our passage from Luke. God is saying it's not about pious, self-congratulatory, religious observance. It's about true devotion of the heart towards God and for those around us. Our reading from Isaiah started at verse 9, but that really concludes what had come before. God, through Isaiah, has been speaking about fasting, and that people may technically have fasted according to the law, but they in the meantime have otherwise done what they please, exploited the workers, for example. Not the humanitarian, selfless purpose which God intended. And he talks about the futile religious bowing of heads and lying in sackcloth and ashes. And God says, and then you wonder why you feel far from me. And he goes on to paint a beautiful picture of his actual intention, that they should fast from being self-centered and rather set the oppressed free, share food with the hungry, provide shelter for the weary. Then Isaiah says in verse 9, then you will call on, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, here I am. Isaiah continues, spend your time fighting oppression. Stop pointing the finger at others. It strikes me these days that happens quite a lot. I mean, personally, I'm a little disappointed that our children seem very quick to blame other people. They get that from their mother. For the avoidance of doubt, none of that is true. And Isaiah goes on with an exquisite depiction of the fruit of serving others. The Lord will guide you always, and you will be like a well-watered garden, a spring whose waters never fail. And as to the Sabbath, keep it. Don't seek your own worldly pleasure on God's holy day. Call it a delight and honorable. Then you will find your joy in the Lord. Isaiah is indicating what a life with God can be like, a life that goes beyond superficial religion. Bear that in mind as we move forward 300 years to Jesus. And we get to Luke chapter 13. We're in the middle of a lot of teaching from Jesus, a host of parables and some hard lessons. On this occasion, as he would have done very regularly, Jesus is teaching in a synagogue on the Sabbath. A crippled woman comes in. Jesus sees her, and rather than ploughing on with the formal liturgy that had been planned, he stops and he calls her over. He lays hands on her and she stands up straight for the first time in 18 years. You'd think everyone would be jubilant. Indeed, Luke tells us that the people were delighted. But the synagogue hierarchy are not impressed. Hey, you can't do that. That counts as work. Healing is not specifically one of the 39 malachah, but it would definitely have been seen as work. And Jesus turns to the synagogue senior leadership team and says, you hypocrites. Why would he say that? Well, I'm glad you asked. Because the purpose of the Sabbath is rest and restoration. What Jesus was doing was technically illegal, but he was honoring the true purpose of Shabbat. It wasn't the first or indeed the last time Jesus had got into trouble on the Sabbath. In Mark chapter 2, he was rebuked by the religious authorities when his disciples are seen picking grain in a field, definitely milachah. And on that occasion, Jesus not only berated the superficial religion of the priests, but goes on to say, the Sabbath was made for the people, not the people made for the Sabbath. And a statement that got him into a lot of trouble, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Jesus is saying, by his words and actions in these episodes, that the law, including the Sabbath commandment, is a gift. It's a gift from a loving God to say, this is how you find your true self. It echoes, doesn't it, God's message in Isaiah. It's the difference between religion and the gospel. My non-Christian friends would, I think, probably describe me as religious. I would say to them, in fact, I'm not at all religious. It may be a bit of semantics, but religion is what we see here in the synagogue. Priests focusing on the detail of the law. If you're operating under the law as a way of seeking God's approval, then of course you've got to get it right. You've got to make sure that you absolutely nail every detail and nuance, like not making two loops. And that can't be easy. For example, these days, does it count as work if you ask Alexa to do something? I'm sure there's a rabbinic ruling on that. It's a minefield. But the gospel, meanwhile, is responding to the grace of God shown in the cross, and then understanding that God's laws are there to enhance our joy, not to be a chain around our necks. It is not setting out how we must try really hard to behave, but how we will want to behave if our hearts are in the right place. When we truly recognize the price that Jesus paid on the cross, and the love and the grace of God turns our hearts to him and to those around us. But we need to trust God, to trust that he is infinitely loving and wise and good. Immediately after God's creative resting on the seventh day, the Bible moves to the Garden of Eden. There was only one law there: don't eat the fruit of that tree. God doesn't explain why. He doesn't rationalize it for Adam and Eve so that they can agree it probably makes sense. He just says, in effect, trust me. But the serpent suggests to them, if you obey that, you're going to miss out. Don't listen to God. Give it a go. And we even today can be beguiled by that serpent's voice. God instructs us to observe the Sabbath, but we decide we might be missing out. And we start to get an idea of the power of a true Sabbath. As I mentioned at the start, the word can mean rest, but it can equally mean cease, stop. Stop dealing with the busyness that takes up our time and attention during the week. Trust God when he says that pausing is the best policy. Because we don't really get a break these days, do we? We're well used to shops being open on Sunday now, aren't we? At least back in the day, we used to get a break when we went on holiday, which of course appropriately is Holy Day. Back then, especially if you went abroad, if you were that lucky, you had no phone. Usually there weren't any English newspapers around. You were out of touch. You wouldn't get endless emails from the office. You wouldn't even know what was going on in the world. It was a proper break. Oh, that just doesn't happen now, does it? Although, to be honest, I suspect we quietly like to be busy, don't we? It often gives us a sense of self-worth. At work, if ever I asked anyone in the office how they were getting on, the answer would invariably be, "Oh, I'm so busy." I used to enjoy saying, if I was asked that, "Oh, I haven't got much on at the moment, really." Generally wasn't true, but I would get the strangest looks. When we think of our Sabbath, do we really switch off? Congratulations if you do. But it's all too easy to come to church for an hour or so, perhaps to start to look at our watches if it seems to be going on for too long, and then charge on with the rest of our day as usual. We use the time to catch up with odd jobs, perhaps checking in on any work stuff going on. All exactly, in fact, the opposite of the principle of Shabbat, and causing us to miss the power of the Sabbath. And God says, stop, rest, just be with me. We speak of the importance of everyday faith, and it is the Sabbath that recharges our batteries to take our faith into the rest of the week. If you've been to one of those extended Christian gatherings, such as Spring Harvest or New Wine and so on, you know what a boost it is to spend that time focused on God. Taking the Sabbath seriously provides us with a weekly top-up that God knows we need. God said we should take 1/7 of the week to rest from our busyness and to focus on him. Now, because I'm an accountant, I worked out that is a little over 14%. If we limit our Sabbath focus on him to an hour in church, that is less than 0.6% of our week. That is quite a difference. So what do we learn from this in our lives today here? Well, I'm glad you asked. What Jesus' example with the crippled woman tells us is that we must be careful not to put religious principles or rules or just the way we do things before caring for people. In that way, we become crippled by a religious burden rather than people who can stand up straight, knowing that God says, "Here I am." And there's one other angle I want to touch on to finish. The Sabbath is thought of as a day of rest, but it was and is also known as the Lord's Day. It is not necessarily a day where we just do nothing. It is a day to devote ourselves to the Lord, a day of worship, whether that be singing inside a building or being out in our community, shining as a light for God's glory. Think again of what we read in Isaiah, of feeding the hungry, of helping the oppressed, in short, of serving others with God's grace. Our parish vision talks of being people on a mission. As part of that, picture the vision of our Sabbath as a church family being gathering to worship in church, but also an opportunity to bless and to serve our community. Imagine our village community seeing Sunday as the day when church comes to town. When we recharge our spiritual batteries, we know that we are filled with God's love. We are renewed and transformed by spending time with him. We are filled again with his Holy Spirit, with the living water that Jesus spoke of. And we are not designed to be reservoirs of all of that. We are designed to be rivers to carry that blessing to others. Embracing the Lord's Day builds us up and equips us to build up others. It brings us closer to God and enables us to pray, "Lord, please bring your kingdom to earth through what I do." All for his glory. And that is the purpose and the power of the Sabbath.